At 2:47 a.m. on December 18, 2019, four unmarked cars stopped in front of a large residential property on Chestnut Hill Road, in the northern part of Detroit, Michigan. The vehicles carried 8 officers in plain clothes. None of them had a warrant. They moved with coordinated speed, avoided headlights, and advanced toward the house as if following a rehearsed plan. Inside lived Demetrius Cross, 48, an FBI agent with 22 years in the Bureau. His specialty was police corruption. Within law enforcement circles, he had gained a reputation for uncovering misconduct inside precincts that considered themselves untouchable. That reputation earned him the nickname, the Judge. For the last 8 months, he had been conducting an internal inquiry into activity connected to several officers in Detroit's 9th Precinct. Among the names under review was Sergeant Kyle Drake, 45, an officer known for aggressive tactics and tight influence within the department. Cross's personal life was strained. In 2007, an error in his casework led to the conviction of an innocent patrol officer. The officer later committed suicide inside a county jail. Cross accepted responsibility, and the pressure he placed on himself afterward became the defining element of his work. That fixation gradually damaged his marriage and distanced him from his only child, Cameron Cross, 19, a first-year journalism student. Cameron had returned home 3 days earlier during winter break. He told his father he was working on important material, but did not elaborate. At 12:37 a.m., 2 hours before the officers arrived, the house's main power line was cut from outside. The breaker panel inside showed no malfunction. Cross later stated that he thought it was a neighborhood outage and planned to start the backup generator after waking. At 2:47 a.m., the 8 officers approached the side entry and used a pry tool to force the door without announcing themselves. Entering the unlit hallway, they moved in 2 groups toward the 2nd floor. They headed directly toward the master bedroom, a room where Cross had slept for years. Unknown to them, 3 weeks earlier, Cross had given that room to Cameron, choosing to use a smaller room across the hall as part of an effort to reconnect with his son. Hearing movement downstairs, Cameron stepped out into the hallway with his hands raised. He attempted to speak, but the officers saw only a tall silhouette. Cameron stood 6 feet 3 inches and had a similar build to his father, which became a critical factor in what followed. Within 1.5 seconds, one officer discharged 3 shots at close range. Cameron collapsed near the doorframe. Cross was awakened by the noise, reached the backup generator in the basement, and activated it. When the lights came on, he heard Sergeant Kyle Drake shout, "It's not him, we're leaving." The officers began to retreat immediately. Their total time inside the house lasted 18 seconds after the gunfire. Cross reached the 2nd floor and found Cameron on the hallway floor. Medical assistance arrived later, but Cameron died 90 seconds after being shot. He remained conscious briefly, according to Cross, but unable to speak. Next to him lay an open laptop. On the desktop was a folder labeled Henderson Case, Do Not Open. Cross recognized the name. Detective Robert Henderson, a long-serving Detroit officer, had been found dead in his garage 2 years earlier. Officially, it had been ruled a suicide. Henderson had been Cross's mentor decades earlier, and was the person who had helped redirect Cross from a turbulent adolescence toward college and eventually the FBI. Cross's ongoing investigation into the 9th Precinct involved several officers who had previously served with or under Henderson. Kyle Drake was one of them. Cross immediately concluded that the officers who entered the home had not come for his son. They had come for him. The lack of a warrant, the precision of their movements, and the targeted approach toward the master bedroom aligned with the idea of an intentional operation rather than a mistake. Cameron's presence in that room, combined with the darkness, caused the misidentification. As Cross checked the laptop, he saw that Cameron had been compiling documents, transcripts, and notes related to the Henderson case. He found partially drafted text that resembled the structure of an investigative article. The files were organized with dates, interview times, and names of individuals connected to Henderson's final months. It became clear that Cameron had accessed information beyond what Cross had ever discussed openly at home. Cross later stated that his immediate thought was not grief, but the realization that Cameron had known something significant. Something that might connect the 8-month corruption inquiry, Henderson's death, and the actions of Sergeant Drake. He also understood that the operation against him was triggered by urgency. Someone wanted him eliminated before whatever Cameron had discovered reached the wrong hands. Standing in the hallway, he tried to reconstruct the timeline. If the power had been cut deliberately at 12:37 a.m., someone had prepared the house for a raid that required darkness. The team arrived at 2:47 a.m., which implied coordination rather than improvisation. Drake's voice during the exit, "It's not him," indicated that he believed Cross should have been in that bedroom. Drake had been aware of Cross's usual sleeping arrangement, meaning he had received recent inside information. 8 months before Cameron was killed, Cross received an anonymous USB drive at the Detroit field office. The drive contained documents indicating wide-scale misconduct inside the 9th Precinct, 47 fabricated or manipulated arrest reports, a list of confidential witness names traded for $50,000 to $300,000, internal message logs between officers discussing evidence tampering. The folder ended with a typed note. "They killed Henderson. He didn't hang himself." Cross opened a formal inquiry, restricted to a small internal team. Among the officers appearing repeatedly in the documents was Sergeant Kyle Drake, the same officer who commanded the unauthorized raid on Cross's home. Cross kept the inquiry sealed, suspecting potential leaks from inside bureau channels. The cloud storage recovered from Cameron provided the first major shift in direction. Inside was a 4-day-old video, filmed in a basement or storage area. The speaker wore a mask and altered his posture to avoid recognition. His voice was filtered, but the message was direct. Henderson was working FBI undercover. The operation was leaked from inside. They killed him. I was there. This recording indicated that Henderson had been cooperating with the FBI in an undisclosed capacity, and that the leak originated from a source with high-level access. Investigators next contacted Naomi Reed, 20, Cameron's girlfriend. She was a nursing student in Detroit who had been dating Cameron for nearly a year. Naomi provided text exchanges showing that Cameron had begun investigating the 9th Precinct on his own 3 months earlier. According to Naomi, Cameron told her he had accidentally overheard a late-night phone conversation between his father and an unknown colleague. That conversation referenced fabricated arrests and witness payments. Cameron wrote to Naomi that, "If I prove it, Father will see me not as a disappointment." Naomi said Cameron carried long-term guilt regarding his parents' divorce, believing his father's work obsession stemmed from failures in the past, and that he, Cameron, reminded him of those failures. Further analysis uncovered Cameron's final message, sent 6 hours before he was shot. It was addressed to Naomi but never opened on her phone because she was on an overnight shift. The message read, "Know who Judas is, someone from FBI. Meeting tomorrow will give all evidence. Said can't go to Father. There's a high-level mole in the office." This was the first direct indication that Cameron had identified a specific individual inside the bureau who was responsible for leaking Henderson's undercover work. Cross reviewed the message and recognized that Cameron had intentionally avoided disclosing the name. Instead, Cameron planned to meet the unnamed source the following morning to transfer all findings. What concerned investigators was the timing. The raid occurred the night before this scheduled meeting. The coincidence suggested that someone within the bureau became aware of Cameron's communication and triggered an emergency intervention. Cross-examined Cameron's interview notes. 7 separate conversations were documented, though 4 lacked recorded audio. 2 of the interviewees were retired officers who had served with Henderson in the early 2000s. One was a former precinct clerk who stated, off record, that Henderson had stepped on the wrong set of operations. None of the interviews mentioned the name of the alleged mole, implying that Cameron had obtained that information during a separate, undocumented meeting. The Bureau's internal digital forensics identified that Cameron's cloud account had been accessed once by an anonymous IP address based in Michigan, approximately 28 hours before the raid. It was likely that someone sought to determine what Cameron had discovered. The access did not delete or alter files, but appeared to map the structure of the folders, indicating reconnaissance rather than interference. Cameron's work suggested a clear escalation. He identified the pattern of corruption, verified that Henderson had been undercover, confirmed that the operation was leaked, and then identified the leak's source. His final message implied urgency and danger, and his preparation for a transfer of evidence made him a liability for anyone involved in Henderson's death. 2 conclusions followed logically. First, Judas referred to an FBI insider with long-term access to operations involving the 9th Precinct. Second, The midnight raid on the Cross residence was not a spontaneous decision by local officers, but a reaction to information that Cameron was prepared to pass to an external recipient the following morning. Following the shooting, the Bureau placed Demetrius Cross on administrative suspension. He was removed from all internal systems, prohibited from contacting officers involved in the 9th Precinct inquiry, and instructed not to conduct any independent review. Cross ignored the directive within 24 hours. For the first time in his career, he decided to run a parallel investigation outside approved procedures, convinced that official channels were compromised. His initial focus was Sergeant Kyle Drake, 45, the officer who led the unauthorized raid. Drake was a former Marine with a record of combat deployments. Colleagues described him as cynical and confrontational. During a past internal review interview, Drake had remarked, "System betrayed us there. Why should we play by its rules?" Cross noted that statement as relevant to motive and mindset. A key detail appeared in the internal incident timeline. 3 days before the raid, Detroit police received an informal message from an FBI contact stating that a dangerous witness connected to a federal corruption investigation was hiding in Agent Cross's home and that officers should conduct a no-warning entry. The communication had no identifying signature. Cross concluded it was the first indicator of a federal leak designed to weaponize local law enforcement. While reviewing Cameron's files, Cross discovered that Cameron had been mapping relationships inside the precinct. He highlighted not only Kyle Drake, but also Captain Thomas Drake, 49, Kyle's older brother. This connection was not previously part of Cross's official case. Cameron's draft outlined a scheme operated over several years. Thomas, in his role as evidence supervisor, would misplace key items in cases against specific defendants. Charges would weaken or collapse entirely, and payments ranging from $100,000 to $500,000 were delivered through intermediaries. According to Cameron's notes, the origin of the arrangement was not voluntary. 8 years earlier, Kyle had returned from Afghanistan with $80,000 in private debt, reportedly tied to illegal gambling. Cameron wrote that Kyle told Thomas, "Either you help or they'll come for your family," forcing Thomas into compliance. From that point, Thomas became a controlled participant rather than the architect. Cross then contacted Detective Layla Morrison, 42, who had overseen the original investigation into Robert Henderson's death. Morrison had since transferred out of homicide and was working in administrative review. She agreed to meet in a neutral office space after hours. Morrison admitted that shortly after Henderson's body was found, she received anonymous photographs of her young daughter outside her school with the message, "Accidents happen." Fearing retaliation, she avoided pursuing inconsistencies in the case. Morrison retrieved a hidden copy of the original autopsy report, which she had kept outside the system. The report contradicted the official suicide ruling. It described bruising consistent with a physical struggle, a ligature technique identified as a Marine Corps knot, and traces of midazolam in Henderson's stomach, a sedative typically administered through injection. Morrison said quietly, "When I saw your son in the news, I realized my silence made me an accomplice." Her information confirmed that Henderson had been murdered, and that individuals with training and specialized access were involved. The Marine-style knot and sedative pointed again toward the Drake network. Cross returned home that night and resumed analyzing Cameron's files. Naomi had mentioned that Cameron stored copies of everything in multiple locations. Cross searched the house thoroughly and found a narrow flash drive taped inside a ventilation shaft in Cameron's room. The drive contained an encrypted archive. After several hours, Cross unlocked it using Cameron's secondary password, which he recognized from an old family account. Inside was the unaltered version of the masked interview. The speaker's voice was clear. It was FBI agent Daniel Cole, 51, Cross's colleague for 15 years and Cameron's godfather. In the recording, Cole explained that he had overseen the undercover operation involving Henderson. He stated that the operation was exposed from inside the Bureau, and that Henderson was killed as a result. Cole said, "Can't go to your father. High-level mole in the office. I supervised Henderson's operation. It was leaked. He was killed. They forced me to stay silent. If you publish the article simultaneously with your father's report, the mole can't bury both attacks." Cameron responded in a steady voice, "I don't blame you. Father taught me. Truth is always more valuable than safety. These were the final recorded words Cameron spoke on the subject. Cross replayed the clip multiple times. He understood that Cameron had not been acting recklessly. He had been trying to follow the example Cross had unintentionally set. For Cameron, proving the case meant proving personal worth. The attempt placed him in direct conflict with the same network that killed Henderson. By the beginning of January 2020, the investigation into the shooting of Cameron Cross had stalled. The county prosecutor signaled readiness to classify the incident as a mistaken entry and close the file. Internal Affairs recommended administrative dismissals for Sergeant Kyle Drake and several involved officers, but no criminal charges. Captain Thomas Drake unexpectedly received a provisional promotion to acting precinct commander, justified as a staffing necessity. Agent Daniel Cole could not be located. Calls to his personal numbers went unanswered, and his bureau credentials were last used 6 days before Cameron's death. Demetrius Cross saw the official narrative solidifying. He understood that if new evidence did not surface immediately, the outcome would freeze in its current form. A bureaucratic error, a misidentified target, no further inquiry. Meanwhile, Cross continued his off-record investigation with Detective Layla Morrison, who remained the only officer willing to cooperate fully. Late one evening, Morrison contacted Cross with a new lead. She had traced an old personnel record referencing a third Drake brother, Vincent Drake, 38, a former patrol officer who had left the department 5 years earlier. He was living in a rehabilitation center in Lansing, receiving treatment for PTSD and long-term substance dependency. Morrison arranged a meeting. Vincent agreed after learning Cross was investigating Henderson's death. During the meeting, Vincent spoke haltingly but consistently. On the night Henderson died, Kyle called him and asked him to assist in scaring a traitor. Vincent explained that he believed it would be an intimidation attempt to force cooperation in an inquiry. When he arrived at the location, Henderson was already restrained. Vincent stated that Kyle injected a sedative into Henderson's neck and that Thomas helped stage the scene to resemble suicide. When Vincent protested, Kyle told him, "Now you're an accomplice. Stay silent." Vincent reported that after the incident he spiraled into unemployment, substance abuse, and 2 suicide attempts. He said he had remained silent because he feared Kyle and believed no one would believe him. After seeing Cameron's death on television, he told Morrison, "My brother won't stop. I can't stay silent anymore." Vincent's testimony strengthened the link between the Drakes and Henderson's murder. But it did not address the central question: who inside the FBI had the power to protect them? 2 days later, Cross received an unmarked envelope sent to his temporary office. Inside was a flash drive. The drive contained security footage from a neighbor's exterior camera, positioned toward the Cross property. The footage showed the final moments before Cameron was shot. Cameron stepped into the hallway with his hands raised. He attempted to speak, but the officer aiming at him, identified by uniform markings as Officer Marcus Green, Kyle Drake's nephew, fired within 1.2 seconds. Immediately after, another voice shouted, "It's not him! Leave!" matching Sergeant Drake's voice from the night of the raid. The envelope also contained a short typed note. "Neighbor was afraid. I copied it. Friend." The typewriter font matched the anonymous note from 2 years earlier that had accompanied the USB about the fabricated cases. Cross concluded the sender was the same person who had first revealed the existence of the corruption network. With Vincent's testimony, Morrison's autopsy findings, Cameron's files, and the neighbor's footage, Cross and Morrison reconstructed the full chain of events except for the highest point, the federal leak. To confirm the identity of Judas, Morrison enlisted a cybersecurity contact who examined outgoing bureau data records tied to the 9th Precinct inquiry. The analysis revealed multiple silent data extractions routed through a private account belonging to FBI Deputy Director Roger Atkins, 61. Atkins had hired Cross into the bureau 22 years earlier. His reputation was that of a strict administrator who rarely interacted with field agents. When Morrison's contact breached Atkins's off-ledger accounts, they found 9 years of payments, $200,000 annually, originating from an offshore account linked to associates of the Drake brothers. Further review showed that Atkins had accessed classified monitoring reports on Henderson's undercover operation days before it was compromised. Records also showed that Atkins was the source of the internal message sent to Detroit police claiming a dangerous witness was hiding in Cross's home. When confronted by federal auditors, Atkins stated, "Gave 35 years. When I needed help, they turned away." He referenced his son's death from an overdose 9 years earlier. The FBI had declined to intervene in the investigation, citing lack of jurisdiction. That grievance appeared to have catalyzed his cooperation with criminal intermediaries, driven by anger rather than profit alone. With Atkins exposed, Cross and Morrison assembled a complete evidentiary package. But half the material, Cameron's concealed files, hacked account logs, and the anonymous footage, was obtained illegally. Morrison warned him that presenting the full archive would compromise both of them. She proposed a controlled option. Atkins would retire quietly, the Drakes would face limited charges, and Cross's career would remain intact. She said, "Quiet cleanup. Minimal damage. If you push further, everything comes down." Vincent offered a crude alternative, stating, "For $50K, they'll solve the problem." Cross refused to consider it. Over the next 3 nights, Cross read Cameron's draft article repeatedly. The final paragraph included a line Cameron had written months earlier. "Truth must be public. Otherwise it's a deal, not justice." Cross concluded that if he accepted a muted resolution, he would repeat the same pattern that had driven Cameron to investigate alone 3 years later. The combined cases resulted in a complex series of trials lasting 26 months. Kyle Drake received a life sentence for murder and conspiracy. Marcus Green was sentenced to 25 years for manslaughter and falsifying reports. Thomas Drake received 18 years for evidence tampering and participation in a criminal enterprise. Roger Atkins was sentenced to 30 years for corruption, obstruction, and facilitation of homicide. Daniel Cole testified under immunity from homicide charges but was fired. He attempted multiple times to contact Cross. Cross did not respond. Vincent Drake entered witness protection and resettled in Oregon, where he worked with veterans recovering from trauma. Layla Morrison left the department, passed the bar exam, and became an attorney. Her daughter later forgave her silence. Cross lived alone in a modest house that he converted into a workspace called Project Cameron. He spent 14 hours a day documenting corruption cases and training younger investigators. Once a month, his ex-wife visited. During one visit, she told him, "Can't forgive. You were obsessed, and Cameron wanted to prove he was worthy. It killed him."